The bus smelled of sweat and stale air as Frank Johnson clutched the metal pole near the front, his knuckles tightening with every jolt of the vehicle over Sacramento's uneven streets. His day, like every other, had been unremarkable. Working, part-time at a community center, feeding Rocky, his loyal mutt, and picking up groceries. A life of quiet monotony suited Frank just fine. It helped him forget the ghosts of Vietnam and the scars, both visible and invisible, that still haunted him. He had spent decades keeping his head down, blending into the shadows, invisible to the world. But today would mark the end of his quiet existence. The bus screeched to a halt at a red light on Stockton Boulevard, jolting passengers forward. Frank shifted his weight, feeling the burn in his knees. As the doors hissed open at the next stop, two teenagers strutted aboard. The taller one, with a buzz cut and an oversized leather jacket, scanned the passengers with a sneer, while the shorter, boy wiry and jittery, stuffed his hands into his pockets. Their conversation was loud and peppered with profanity as they weaved through the crowded aisle, drawing annoyed glances from other passengers. Frank stiffened when they stopped near an elderly black man sitting by the window. "Hey, old man," Buzzcut sneered, smacking the metal railing. "You deaf? Move it! That's our seat now!" The old man, probably in his 70s, didn't even look up. His hands, rough and wrinkled, gripped the edge of his cane tighter. Frank could see the man's lips tighten, a silent refusal. Jittery leaned in, his voice oozing menace. "You got a death wish or something? We're not asking twice." Frank's jaw clenched. He had seen bullies before, on the playgrounds of his youth, in the barracks during basic training, and in the jungles where power games could mean life or death. It was always the same, the weak exploiting the weaker. A spark of anger flared in his chest. He tried to suppress it, but then the taller teen grabbed the old man's cane and yanked it away. "Hey!" Frank's voice cut through the murmurs of the bus. Heads turned, some passengers instinctively pulling out their phones. The teen holding the cane turned, his grin faltering as he met Frank's piercing gaze. "You got something to say, old-timer?" Buzzcut stepped closer, sizing him up. The boy might have been bigger, but he lacked the years of training etched into every fiber of Frank's body. Frank forced his voice to stay calm. "Give him his cane back. Nobody needs to get hurt." The bus was silent except for the rumble of its engine. Buzzcut let out a laugh, tossing the cane to Jittery, who caught it awkwardly. "Oh, this guy's a comedian." Jittery joined in, his laugh shaky. "What are you gonna do, Grandpa? Sit down before you break a hip." Frank's eyes didn't waver. "Last chance." His voice was low, deliberate. Years of discipline suppressed the urge to act too soon, but the instinct was there, coiled like a spring. Buzzcut moved first. His fist shot toward Frank's face, but Frank sidestepped with ease, grabbing the teen's wrist and twisting it with calculated precision. Buzzcut screamed as his arm was wrenched behind his back. Frank shoved him toward the nearest pole, his forehead smacking the metal with a loud clang. Before Jittery could react, Frank swung his leg into the back of the boy's knees, sending him sprawling to the floor. The cane clattered to the ground, and Frank scooped it up, holding it like an extension of his own arm. "Get up!" Frank growled at Jittery, who scrambled backward on all fours, his bravado gone. Buzzcut groaned, clutching his head, but managed to stagger upright. "You're dead, old man," he spat, his lip bleeding. Frank's only response was a hard stare. His breathing was steady, his body ready for whatever came next, but it didn't come. Buzzcut grabbed his friend by the jacket, and they stumbled toward the doors, yelling for the driver to let them out. The bus screeched to a halt, and the two bolted onto the sidewalk, disappearing into the streets. The passengers erupted into applause, but Frank ignored them. He turned to the old man, who was still gripping his seat, eyes wide with shock. "You okay?" Frank asked, handing back the cane. The old man nodded, his voice trembling. "Thank you. I didn't think anyone would step in." Frank gave a small nod, then returned to his place near the front of the bus. He felt the weight of every stare on him, the whispered conversations buzzing louder than the engine. He didn't care. He just wanted to get home. By the time the bus reached his stop, Frank had nearly forgotten the incident. But as he stepped off, a teenager ran up to him, phone in hand. "Hey man, you're a freaking legend. That video's gonna blow up," the boy exclaimed before darting back onto the bus. Frank frowned. Video. He glanced over his shoulder, catching glimpses of passengers still holding their phones aloft. A sinking feeling settled in his gut. That night, as he sat on the couch with Rocky's head resting on his lap, the full weight of the day hit him. His phone buzzed incessantly, notifications lighting up the screen. He finally caved and clicked. On one. There it was, grainy footage of him dismantling the teens, already racking up thousands of views under the caption, "Sacramento's badass grandpa saves the day." Frank groaned. He didn't feel like a hero. He felt tired, but it seemed the world had other plans. Frank Johnson sat in the dimly lit living room of his modest Sacramento home, the faint hum of the refrigerator the only sound accompanying his thoughts. The events of the last week had transformed his life into something unrecognizable. Viral fame wasn't something he had ever anticipated. Murals of his face had appeared downtown. Strangers greeted him as if they'd known him for years, and his image adorned shirts being sold at local markets. His picture plastered across social media was unsettling, and yet it didn't stop his life from marching forward, even if in an unusual direction. As he sipped his coffee, his mind wandered back to his childhood. Frank had grown up on the outskirts of Sacramento, a sprawling farmland where early mornings were spent herding cattle and repairing fences. His father's calloused hands and weathered face were constant reminders of the value of hard work. Back then, his life seemed simple and full of promise. There was Lindsay, too, his high school sweetheart. Her laughter was the soundtrack of his youth, and their shared dreams of a life together were what kept him anchored during the long, grueling days. But everything changed with the draft notice. The envelope had arrived on a brisk September morning, carrying the weight of a future he had no choice but to accept. Lindsay had cried when he told her he'd be leaving, though she promised to wait for him. For a while, her letters were his lifeline during the war, each word pulling him back to the boy who once imagined a quiet life on the farm. The war, however, had other plans for Frank. 7 long years passed, years filled with blood-soaked jungle floors, the deafening roar of gunfire, and the haunting cries of comrades lost. He had been taken prisoner for a harrowing year, enduring endless interrogations and the searing pain of improvised torture methods. By the time he returned home, his reflection in the mirror felt like that of a stranger. Sacramento had moved on without him. Lindsay, unable to endure the uncertainty of his return, had married someone else. Frank understood her choice, but it left a hollow ache that even time struggled to dull. The dreams of becoming a police officer, something he had clung to as a way to channel his skills, shattered when the department rejected him due to his war injuries and psychological scars. Without direction, he drifted, picking up odd jobs and eventually landing on the corner of 5th and Main, selling hot dogs to make ends meet. Even then, Frank hadn't allowed despair to consume him entirely. He had his dog Rocky and a daily purpose in his modest work. Every penny he earned went toward helping his aging mother, whose health had steadily declined. Life became a rhythm, each day blending into the next, until the incident on the bus. But with the fame came cracks in his carefully maintained quiet existence. The media frenzy and attention from local authorities brought with it memories Frank had tried to bury. One morning, as he adjusted the lock on his hot dog cart, a shadow fell across him. He looked up to find Brian Cooper, his old war buddy, standing there with a familiar crooked grin. "Frank, you son of a gun, didn't think I'd ever see you on a t-shirt." Brian teased, leaning casually against a nearby lamppost. Frank blinked, momentarily stunned. "Brian? What the hell are you doing here?" Brian shrugged, his expression shifting from jovial to somber. "Saw your face all over the news. Figured if there's one guy who'd hate the attention more than me, it'd be you." Frank smirked, but didn't deny it. Brian's unexpected visit felt like the past knocking on his door. They hadn't spoken in years, though their bond remained unspoken, forged in the fires of survival and loss. The two veterans fell into easy conversation, trading stories about life after the war. It wasn't long before Brian invited himself over to Frank's place, a bottle of whiskey in hand, and they sat reminiscing late into the night. Over the next few weeks, Brian's presence became a constant in Frank's life. They shared meals, talked about the absurdity of Frank's sudden fame, and even began tackling the much-neglected repairs on Frank's house. For the first time in years, Frank felt a flicker of companionship that didn't come with strings or expectations. One evening, as they sat on the porch, Brian's tone shifted. "I've got something I need you to hold on to for me," he said, sliding a small, unassuming USB drive across the table. Frank furrowed his brow. "What's on it?" Brian hesitated, his fingers drumming against his leg. "Just some files I'm working on, personal stuff. It's safer with you." Frank's instincts prickled. Brian wasn't one to ask for favors lightly. "You in trouble?" "Not yet," Brian said with a hollow laugh. "But let's just say it's better if you don't ask too many questions." Frank didn't press further, though unease settled in his chest. He placed the USB in the lockbox, where he kept his discharge papers and other valuables, brushing it off as another quirk of Brian's eccentricity. The following days felt like a strange calm before a storm. One morning, Frank woke to find his porch empty and a note left on the table. "Went to grab smokes. Be back soon. B." Frank didn't think much of it until the hours stretched on with no sign of Brian. His phone buzzed in the early afternoon, the number unfamiliar. "Mr. Johnson, this is Detective Ramirez with Sacramento PD. We need you to come to the station." Frank's heart sank as he listened to the detective's clipped explanation. Brian had been found in a parking lot, shot in what appeared to be a robbery gone wrong. Frank's hand trembled as he hung up the phone, grief and guilt washing over him. At the station, identifying Brian's body felt like a dagger to his already wounded spirit. But something about the detective's demeanor set him on edge. They were too quick to dismiss the incident as random violence. It didn't sit right with Frank, and his mind drifted back to the USB drive. That night, Frank opened the lockbox and stared at the unassuming piece of technology. He didn't know what Brian had gotten himself into, but he felt the weight of it now resting on his shoulders. Something about this wasn't over, and for the first time in years, the soldier in him stirred, ready for battle. Frank sat at the small dining table in his kitchen, the USB drive lying in front of him like a grenade waiting to be triggered. The air felt heavier than usual, suffused with an uneasy silence, broken only by Rocky's soft breathing at his feet. Brian's death wasn't random. Frank was sure of that now. He had seen enough in his time to know when someone was taken out deliberately. His fingers hovered over the drive before he finally slid it into the old laptop he kept for paying bills. The screen lit up, and a single folder appeared. TCL files. Frank opened it, revealing a collection of documents, spreadsheets, and videos. As he scrolled through, his pulse quickened. The documents outlined an intricate network of payoffs, bribes, and shady contracts linked to construction projects in Sacramento. The initials TCL appeared repeatedly, tied to a company named Terrence Clark Logistics. The spreadsheets were even more damning, showing transactions funneled to political figures, including Mayor William Daniels. Brian had stumbled onto something massive. This wasn't just corruption. It was a conspiracy involving city officials. and criminal elements working hand in hand. The weight of the revelation hit Frank like a freight train. If Brian had been killed for this, then anyone connected to him could be next. Frank leaned back in his chair, staring at the screen. He needed answers, and sitting here wouldn't provide them. He decided to visit the last place Brian had been, seen alive, the convenience store parking lot. Grabbing his jacket and keys, he pocketed the USB drive, secured it in a metal tin, and slid it into his locked glove compartment. The sun was dipping below the horizon when Frank arrived at the Dage parking lot, its dim overhead lights casting long shadows across the cracked asphalt. He parked a good distance from the spot where the yellow police tape fluttered in the evening breeze. Most of it had been removed, but the remnants clung stubbornly to the signpost marking the scene of Brian's death. Frank approached cautiously, scanning the area. The few bystanders milling around were disinterested, their attention fixed on their phones or conversations. Kneeling near the faint stains on the pavement, he noticed something glinting under a nearby dumpster. Using a stick, he fished it out, a spent shell casing. Frank's breath caught. The caliber wasn't something a common street thug would carry. It was military grade. His thoughts were interrupted by the distant rumble of an engine. A black SUV rolled into the parking lot, its windows tinted dark. Frank stood, watching as the vehicle idled for a moment before its passenger door opened. A man in a crisp grey suit stepped out, his gaze scanning the lot. The man's eyes landed on Frank, narrowing slightly. Frank turned and started walking toward his car, his instincts screaming at him to keep moving. He could hear the man's footsteps behind him, quickening to match his pace. "Hey, buddy," the man called out. "Hold up a second." Frank ignored him, reaching his car and unlocking the door. Before he could climb in, the man's hand landed on his shoulder. "I said, hold up." The man repeated, his tone firm but calm. Frank turned slowly, his eyes locking with the man's. Up close, he saw the telltale bulge of a concealed firearm beneath the suit jacket. "What do you want?" "Just some friendly advice," the man said, his grip tightening slightly. "Stop poking around where you don't belong." Frank's expression didn't falter. "And who's giving this friendly advice?" "Let's just say I represent people who don't appreciate unnecessary attention," the man replied, his smile sharp and insincere. "You've had your moment of fame. Best to enjoy it and leave the rest alone." Frank shifted his weight subtly, calculating his next move. "You always this polite, or am I special?" The man chuckled, releasing his grip and stepping back. "Consider this your only warning. Keep your nose clean, and you'll live to see that dog of yours again." Frank's jaw tightened, but he said nothing as the man returned to the SUV. The vehicle roared away, leaving him standing alone in the dim light. Back in his car, Frank gripped the steering wheel, his knuckles white. Threats didn't scare him, but they sure as hell pissed him off. He had spent years keeping his head down, avoiding conflict. Now, for the first time in decades, he felt the familiar burn of defiance rising in his chest. His next stop was a name he had spotted in the documents: Terrence Clark. A quick search on his phone revealed that Clark owned a series of properties in the city, including a bar downtown. It seemed like as good a place as any to start. The bar was a dimly lit dive, with a flickering neon sign reading Clark's. Frank parked a few blocks away and approached on foot, blending into the evening crowd. Inside, the air was thick with smoke and the sound of clinking glasses. Frank scanned the room, his eyes landing on a man sitting in the corner booth, a stocky figure in a tailored suit, surrounded by two burly men who clearly weren't there for the conversation. Frank ordered a beer at the bar, keeping one ear on the chatter around him. The name Panther came up more than once, spoken in hushed tones. Whoever this Panther was, he seemed to hold considerable sway over the people here. When Frank's opportunity came, he took it. As one of the bodyguards stepped away, Frank slid into the booth across from Clark, setting his beer on the table. "Terrence Clark," Frank said evenly, "we need to talk." Clark looked up, startled, but quickly masked it with a smirk. "Do I know you?" "Not yet," Frank replied, leaning forward. "But I know about the deals, the money, the mayor, and I know about Panther." Clark's smirk faltered, his eyes darting toward his remaining bodyguard. Before the man could move, Frank's hand shot out, gripping Clark's wrist like a vice. "You're going to tell me everything," Frank said, his voice low and cold. "Because if you don't, the next time you see me, it won't be for a conversation." Clark's face paled, sweat beading on his brow. "You don't know what you're getting into," he stammered. "Neither did Brian Cooper," Frank shot back. "Look where it got him." Clark's lips trembled, but he nodded. Okay, I'll talk, but not here." Frank released his grip, standing as the bodyguard returned, eyeing him warily. Frank walked out of the bar without looking back, knowing that whatever came next would only pull him deeper into the darkness Brian had uncovered. Frank stepped onto the cracked pavement outside Clark's bar, the city's distant hum muted by the weight of what he had just uncovered. Terence Clark had reluctantly given up Panther's name, and the web of corruption that tied the criminal world to Sacramento's political elite was more intricate than Frank had imagined. The air felt heavier as Frank replayed Clark's words in his mind, noting every detail about Panther's operations and the risks he had just invited into his life. His next move was clear. Frank needed to gather more information and figure out who he could trust in this murky conspiracy. The first step was revisiting the evidence on the USB drive, piecing together the breadcrumbs that Brian had left behind. As he walked back to his car, he felt a strange sensation prickling at the back of his neck, a soldier's instinct warning of unseen eyes. He stopped, pretending to check his phone, and glanced around. A car sat parked across the street, its windows tinted too dark to see through. It hadn't been there when he entered the bar. Another quick look confirmed the subtle glint of a camera lens peeking from its side window. Frank's lips tightened, but he didn't break stride, continuing toward his car with calculated calm. When he reached his vehicle, Frank opened the door and slid in smoothly, tossing his jacket onto the passenger seat. He kept his movements, deliberate, not betraying his awareness of the surveillance. Once inside, he adjusted the rearview mirror to catch a glimpse of the car. It didn't move, but he knew they were watching. Instead of driving directly home, Frank made a series of deliberate turns through downtown, weaving through side streets and circling back on himself. The tale was persistent, but not professional enough to avoid detection. Frank took a sharp right onto a quieter street, then veered into an alleyway where he parked behind a dumpster. The sound of the trailing car echoed as it passed, its driver unaware that Frank had slipped out of sight. Frank sat in the shadows, breathing deeply to steady his pulse. The stakes were rising. He stayed there for 10 minutes before doubling back on foot, taking the long route home to ensure he wasn't followed. When he finally reached his house, exhaustion mingled with adrenaline as he locked the door and leaned against it, his mind racing. He poured a glass of water and sat at the dining table, laying out the information he'd gathered so far. Terence had mentioned that Panther operated out of an old warehouse near the industrial district, using it as a hub for his more clandestine activities. It wasn't much, but it was enough to plan his next move. Frank's train of thought was interrupted by a soft knock at the door. Rocky barked once, alert but not frantic. Frank approached the peephole cautiously, his hand resting on the concealed pistol mounted by the doorframe. Through the glass, he saw Amber Miller, his neighbor, standing nervously with her young son, Martin clutching her hand tightly. He opened the door, his brow furrowing. "Amber, it's late. Everything okay?" Amber's eyes darted around nervously before settling on Frank's face. "I didn't know who else to turn to," she said in a hushed voice. "It's Derek. He's drunk again." Frank's jaw tightened. Amber's husband, Derek, was well known in the neighborhood for his violent outbursts, particularly when he'd had too much to drink. Frank had intervened once before when he'd heard shouting through the thin walls of their homes. But Derek's temper hadn't cooled. Amber glanced back toward her house. He started throwing things. "I didn't want Martin to see any more of it." Frank nodded, his voice calm. "You're safe here, both of you." He stepped aside to let them in, motioning for Martin to sit on the couch. Rocky padded over, sniffing curiously before wagging his tail, sensing the boy's unease. Amber lingered by the door, her hands twisting anxiously. "Did he see you leave?" Frank asked. "I don't think so," Amber said. "But you know how he is." Frank's gaze hardened. "Stay here, lock the door behind me. If he comes looking, call the police." Amber grabbed his arm. "Frank, please don't." "I won't do anything stupid," he promised, though his tone carried the weight of a man who wouldn't tolerate threats to the people he cared about. Frank stepped out into the cool night air, his boots crunching softly against the gravel as he crossed the narrow yard, separating their homes. Derek's house loomed dark and silent, except for the faint flicker of light from the living room window. As Frank approached, he heard the muffled crash of something shattering inside, followed by a string of curses. He knocked firmly on the door, waiting a beat before knocking again, harder this time. The sounds inside stopped abruptly. Moments later, the door swung open, revealing Derek's disheveled figure. His bloodshot eyes widened when he saw Frank. "What the hell do you want?" Derek slurred, his voice thick with alcohol. "We need to talk," Frank said, his tone leaving no room for argument. Derek laughed bitterly, leaning against the doorframe. "About what? How you're screwing with my family?" Frank didn't flinch. "You're out of control, Derek. Amber and Martin don't deserve this." Derek's expression darkened, and he stepped closer, his breath reeking of whiskey. "You think you're some kind of hero, huh? Because you went viral? Let me tell you something." Before he could finish, Derek's fist shot toward Frank's face. Frank dodged effortlessly, grabbing Derek's arm and twisting it behind his back. Derek howled in pain, struggling uselessly against Frank's iron grip. "I'm only going to say this once," Frank said, his voice cold and steady. "If you ever hurt them again, you'll have to deal with me, and I promise you don't want that." He shoved Derek back, letting him stumble against the wall. Derek glared at him but didn't move, clutching his arm and muttering curses under his breath. Frank stepped back, keeping his eyes locked on Derek as he retreated. "Get your act together, Derek. You're lucky tonight ends with a warning." As Frank walked away, he could feel Derek's seething gaze burning into his back, but he didn't look back. When he returned home, Amber was sitting on the couch, her hands clasped tightly around a mug of tea Frank had made earlier. She looked up as he entered, relief washing over her face. "Thank you," she said softly. Frank nodded, his expression softening. "You and Martin can stay as long as you need." That night, after Amber and Martin had settled into the guest room, Frank sat back at his laptop. His confrontation with Derek had reminded him of what was at stake, not just for Amber and Martin, but for everyone caught in the web of corruption and violence that Panther controlled. He leaned forward, his fingers hovering over the keyboard. Tomorrow, he would visit that warehouse, armed with whatever courage and cunning he could muster. The fight wasn't just about exposing the truth anymore. It was about protecting the people who couldn't protect themselves, just like Brian had tried to do. Frank's resolve hardened. He was ready for whatever came next. Frank crouched behind a rusted shipping container, his breath visible in the chilly night air. The industrial district was eerily quiet, except for the hum of distant machinery. Ahead, the warehouse stood like a fortress, its corrugated metal, walls covered in graffiti and grime. A single dim light flickered above the entrance, and 2 armed guards flanked the main door. Frank studied their movements, noting the lazy way they held their weapons. Amateurs. But even amateurs could kill, if given the chance. He adjusted the strap of his old duffel bag, the weight of its contents reassuring against his shoulder. Inside were tools he hoped he wouldn't need: a crowbar, duct tape, a flashlight, and a switchblade. His pistol rested snugly in its holster beneath his jacket. Every step of this plan was a gamble, but Frank had learned long ago that hesitation could be fatal. Slipping through the shadows, Frank moved to the side of the warehouse, where a series of large vents lined the walls. One of them had been pried open slightly, leaving just enough room for him to squeeze through. He gritted his teeth as he pulled himself inside, the metal scraping against his jacket. The air was thick with the stench of oil and mildew, and every creak of the vent echoed like a drumbeat in his ears. Frank crawled forward, peering through the slats of the vent into the warehouse below. Rows of crates filled the space, some marked with cryptic symbols, others bearing logos of legitimate companies. Men moved between the stacks, their voices carrying over the low hum of a generator. At the center of it all was Panther. The man's presence was commanding even from above. Dressed in all black, his muscular frame moved with a predatory grace. His face was partially obscured by the brim of a baseball cap, but the scar cutting across his jaw was unmistakable. He was shouting orders to his men, gesturing to a table where weapons and stacks of cash were being sorted. Frank's jaw tightened. This wasn't just a small-time operation. It was an arsenal ready for war. As he continued observing, Frank noticed a commotion near the back of the warehouse. Two men were dragging someone toward Panther. The prisoner's face came into view. Bloodied but recognizable, it was Terrence Clark. Frank's stomach twisted. Clark must have tried to run or double-cross Panther, and now he was paying the price. Frank weighed his options. Charging in head first was suicide, but waiting too long would seal Clark's fate. He scanned the room for anything he could use, to his advantage. His eyes settled on a stack of oil drums near the wall, a few of which were precariously balanced. An idea formed in his mind, one as reckless as it was desperate. Moving quickly, Frank crawled through the vent until he found an access hatch. He eased it open and dropped silently onto a platform overlooking the warehouse floor. From this vantage point, he could see a narrow staircase leading down and, more importantly, a fire alarm on the wall below. If he could create enough chaos, it might give him the opening he needed. He pulled the crowbar from his bag and moved toward the oil drums. With precise strikes, he loosened the bolts holding the topmost drum in place. It wobbled precariously before crashing down, hitting the ones below like dominoes. The sound was deafening, and oil began to spill across the floor. "Hey! What was that?" one of the guards shouted, his voice echoing through the warehouse. Before anyone could react, Frank sprinted to the fire alarm and yanked it. The shrill scream of the alarm filled the air, drowning out the shouts of confusion. Lights flashed as sprinklers activated, soaking the men and the crates below. The chaos was instant. Panther roared, his voice cutting through the noise. "Find out who's here! Now!" Frank used the confusion to descend the staircase, sticking to the shadows. He crept toward the table, where Clark was now slumped, barely conscious. One of Panther's men stood guard, his back turned as he barked orders into a radio. Frank didn't hesitate. He grabbed the man from behind, locking an arm around his neck and squeezing until the guard went limp. Easing the body to the ground, Frank grabbed the pistol from the man's holster and tucked it into his belt. "Clark," Frank whispered, crouching next to the beaten man. "Can you walk?" Clark's swollen eyes blinked sluggishly. "Frank, you're insane." "Noted. Can you move?" Frank repeated, his tone sharper. Clark groaned but nodded weakly. Frank helped him to his feet, supporting most of his weight. They moved as quickly as Clark's injuries allowed, weaving through the chaos. Panther's men were fanning out, some slipping on the oil-slicked floor, while others shouted conflicting orders. Their path to the exit was blocked by two guards who had their weapons drawn, scanning the room. Frank pressed Clark against a stack of crates, his mind racing. He needed a distraction. Reaching into his bag, he pulled out a small smoke bomb, something he'd grabbed from a surplus store on a whim. He lit it and tossed it toward the guards. It exploded in a cloud of thick grey smoke, sending them into a coughing frenzy. Using the cover, Frank and Clark slipped past them, the exit just ahead. But as they reached the door, a gunshot rang out, and the wall beside Frank's head exploded in a shower of splinters. He turned to see Panther, his pistol raised, his eyes locked on Frank with cold fury. "You picked the wrong fight, old man," Panther growled, advancing steadily. Frank shoved Clark toward the door. "Go, I'll hold him off." "Frank, go!" Frank barked, cutting off any argument. Clark stumbled out into the night, leaving Frank alone to face Panther. The two men circled each other, the tension crackling like electricity. Panther moved first, firing off a shot that Frank barely dodged. He returned fire, his shot grazing Panther's shoulder. The larger man didn't flinch, closing the distance between them with alarming speed. Panther swung his pistol like a club, catching Frank across the jaw. Stars exploded in Frank's vision as he staggered back, but he recovered quickly, using the momentum to drive his knee into Panther's ribs. The fight devolved into a brutal melee, both men grappling and trading blows. Panther's strength was formidable, but Frank's training and experience gave him an edge. With a final, desperate effort, Frank used the crowbar to knock the pistol from Panther's hand and sweep his legs out from under him. Panther hit the ground hard, but before Frank could finish him, the sound of sirens filled the air. Flashing red and blue lights danced across the walls as police vehicles screeched. "To a stop outside," Panther smirked, blood trickling from his lip. "This isn't over, Johnson." Frank didn't respond. He slipped out a side door just as the police stormed the building, leaving Panther to face them alone. As Frank disappeared into the night, his mind raced. The fight was far from over, but for now, he had bought himself and Clark another day. Frank stood in the glow of the early morning sun, leaning against the hood of his battered truck. The events of the previous night played like a reel in his mind. Panther's cold glare, the raw desperation in Clark's voice, the chaos of the warehouse. A faint ache lingered in his ribs, where Panther had landed a brutal blow, but the adrenaline that had carried him through the fight still thrummed in his veins. Clark sat in the passenger seat, his face swollen and discolored from the beating he'd endured. His breathing was shallow but steady. Frank had driven them to the outskirts of Sacramento, parking on a dirt road that led to an abandoned orchard. It was as far from prying eyes as Frank could manage, a temporary refuge in the growing storm. "You look like hell," Frank said. Breaking the silence, Clark gave a weak chuckle, wincing as he touched his cheek. "Says the guy with dried blood on his shirt." Frank ignored the comment, his focus shifting to the small metal tin in his hand. The USB drive inside felt heavier than it should, its secrets capable of bringing down powerful men or getting them all killed. He opened it and handed the drive to Clark. "I need you to explain everything. No more half-truths, no more dodging. What's on this, and why is it worth dying for?" Clark hesitated, his fingers trembling as he took the drive. He swallowed. His voice hoarse. "The documents link Mayor Daniels and several others to Panther's operation. Money laundering, illegal arms deals, bribes, it's all there. Panther's their enforcer, but Daniels is the one pulling strings. They've been using city contracts to funnel millions into their pockets." Frank's jaw tightened. "Why? Didn't you go to the cops?" Clark scoffed. "You think they'd listen? Half the force is in Daniel's pocket. The only reason I'm still breathing is because I didn't trust anyone enough to hand over the drive. Until now." Frank glanced toward the horizon, his mind racing. The drive was a time bomb, and the more they delayed, the closer Panther's men would get. But Clark's revelation gave Frank an idea. A risky, dangerous idea, but one that could. "And tip the scales. We need to go public," Frank said. "Expose everything. Make it so big they can't bury it." Clark frowned. "You mean leak it?" Frank nodded. "Not just leak it, broadcast it. We get this in front of every news outlet, every social media account, every honest cop left in the city. If Daniels and Panther can't control the narrative, they'll start turning on each other." Clark's skepticism was clear. "That's assuming we don't get killed first," Frank smirked grimly. "That's always the assumption." The plan began to take shape as Frank and Clark worked through the details. They used a burner laptop Frank had stashed in his truck, carefully uploading the files to an encrypted cloud server. With the documents secured, Frank made a list of trusted reporters and whistleblower platforms. He wasn't naive enough to believe the fight would end here, but it was a start. By the time they finished, the sun was high in the sky, casting long shadows across the orchard. Frank packed up their gear, his movements deliberate as he double-checked their surroundings. "We need to split up," Frank said. "They'll be looking for both of us. You lay low, keep your head down. I'll handle the next part." Clark hesitated, but he knew better than to argue. "What about you?" Frank's eyes hardened. "I've got some unfinished business." He dropped Clark at a safe house he knew from his years of working odd jobs around the city, then turned his truck toward downtown Sacramento. His destination was clear, the mayor's office. If Daniels was the head of the snake, Frank needed to cut it off before Panther regrouped. The City Hall building loomed ahead, its gleaming facade hiding the rot within. Frank parked a block away, opting to approach on foot. As he neared the building, he spotted an unmarked black SUV idling nearby. His pulse quickened. Panther's men were already here. Frank slipped into a side alley, watching as two men exited the vehicle and entered the building. Their stiff posture and subtle bulges beneath their jackets confirmed they were armed. He'd have to be smart about this. Any slip-up could end with a bullet. He followed them inside, keeping a safe distance. The lobby was crowded enough to provide cover, and he watched as the men headed for the elevators. Frank took the stairs, his boots silent against the concrete. When he reached the top floor, he found the hallway empty, save for the faint sound of voices coming from the mayor's office. Frank pressed his back against the wall, inching closer. Through the crack of the door, he saw Mayor Daniels pacing behind his desk, his face flushed with anger. Panther stood opposite him, his imposing figure dominating the room. "This is spiraling out of control," Daniels hissed. "That damn video is everywhere. People are asking questions." Panther's voice was cold. "Then we shut them up. Start with Johnson." Frank's grip tightened on his pistol. The temptation to burst in was strong, but he forced himself to wait. He needed the right moment, and if the cops get involved, Daniels asked, his voice trembling. "We'll all go down," Panther smirked. "Not if they're too busy cleaning up a different mess. We stage something big, something that takes the heat off us." The words sent a chill down Frank's spine. He couldn't wait any longer. He pushed the door open, his pistol leveled at Panther. "Game over," Frank said, stepping into the room. Panther turned slowly, a predatory smile spreading across his face. "Johnson, I was wondering when you'd show up." Daniels shrank behind his desk, his hands trembling. "What do you want?" Frank's gaze didn't waver. "For you to answer for what you've done." Panther moved first, lunging toward Frank with the speed of a trained killer. Frank fired, the bullet grazing Panther's shoulder, but it wasn't enough to stop him. Panther tackled Frank, sending them both crashing to the floor. The room erupted into chaos. Daniels screamed as the two men grappled, the pistol skidding across the floor. Panther's fists were like sledgehammers, but Frank's experience and grit kept him in the fight. He landed a sharp elbow to Panther's ribs, creating enough space to reach for the fallen weapon. Before Panther could recover, Frank aimed and fired, the shot striking him in the leg. Panther roared in pain, collapsing to the ground. Frank stood, breathing hard, his pistol trained on Daniels. "It's over," Frank growled. "Call your friends. Tell them to stand down." Daniels fumbled for his phone, his face pale. All right, just don't shoot." As Daniels made the call, Frank kept his focus on Panther, who glared up at him with seething hatred. "This isn't over, Johnson," Panther spat. "You can't stop what's coming." Frank didn't respond. He could hear the distant wail of sirens growing louder. Backup was on the way, but this fight was finished. When the police arrived, Frank surrendered the pistol, his hands raised. Daniels and Panther were taken into custody, their empire crumbling under the weight of their own greed. As Frank stepped out into the sunlight, a sense of calm washed over him. The battle was won, and for the first time in years, he felt like the man he was meant to be.
If you enjoyed the story and want to see more content like this, support the channel by subscribing, liking, and turning on notifications.